The story does not begin with Greenland, it begins with a map. On most atlases, Greenland is an oversized blur, an icy landmass inflated by the distortion of projection and forgotten by most people who do not live within shouting distance of the Arctic Circle. It looks futile, distant and barren, a place useful only for trivia or visual jokes about maps. But great powers do not read atlases the way civilians do. They do not look for population, culture or comfort. They look for leverage. They look for choke points, passageways, vulnerabilities, dependencies. They read geography the way bankers read balance sheets. What creates advantage, what reduces risk, what pays dividends over time. And on that map, Greenland is not a joke. It is not empty. It is not irrelevant. It is a platform, and platforms decide the future of empires. The United States understood this earlier than anyone, which is why in 1946, just after World War II had ended, Washington tried to buy Greenland outright from Denmark for what would today be billions of dollars. People laughed then. They laughed again when President Trump revived the idea in 2019. But here's the rule the public always forgets. When empires laugh, they lie. When they deny, they care. Because the truth was never really about Greenland. It was about what lies beneath it, above it, and around it. If the 19th century belonged to coal and the 20th to oil, the 21st belongs to something colder, more strategic, and more unforgiving. Rare earth elements, critical minerals, semiconductors, supply chains, data, missile defense, polar trade routes. All of them converge somewhere between the Bering Strait and the Greenland Sea. China understood this, long before Western media bothered to notice. Over the last 2 decades, Beijing did something unprecedented. It built the world's most efficient rare earth supply chain, then wrapped it around global electronics and renewable energy like a noose. The world didn't panic at first, because most people never understood what rare earths were. They sounded abstract, geological trivia for nerds in lab coats. But the truth was simpler. If a country controls rare earths, it controls the future's hardware. Smartphones, missiles, drones, radars, EV batteries, satellites, jet engines, stealth coatings, data centers, wind turbines, and the chips that make the modern world think. Every advanced military system needs them, every emerging technology consumes them, and every superpower depends on them. Which is why the real crisis was not that China mined rare earths. It was that China processed them. That single bottleneck gave Beijing a form of leverage that no navy could blockade and no army could seize. America looked at the numbers, ran the projections, and realized something terrifying. If China can cut the West off from rare earths in a crisis, the US cannot fight a modern war, cannot sustain a modern economy, and cannot compete in the technologies that decide the century. And then the ice began to melt. Climate change did something no diplomat could negotiate, and no general could enforce. It cracked open the Arctic. New sea lanes emerged, shorter and cheaper than the ones that powered global trade for a century. The ice that once protected the North like a natural fortress became a logistics corridor. China had a phrase for this: the Polar Silk Road. To Beijing, the Arctic was not cold, distant, or irrelevant. It was the missing link in a network designed to reroute trade, energy, and power around the US and its allies. To Washington, that was the moment the clock started ticking. Because if China became a permanent presence in the Arctic, and if that presence intersected with critical minerals, rare earths, uranium, nickel, copper, then the United States had a problem far bigger than Greenland. It had a problem with the future. Greenland is not a country with a military. It does not have a nuclear arsenal. It does not command continents or oceans. But it has 3 things that make superpowers nervous: geography, minerals, access. And once Beijing set its eyes on Greenland, Washington finally understood what it had been ignoring. In 2018, a Chinese state-backed company attempted to finance and build 3 Arctic airports in Greenland. On paper, it looked harmless: civil infrastructure, loans, development. But in empire logic, airports are not airports. They are dual-use assets: civilian in peacetime, military in crisis. No superpower lets a rival establish logistics hubs near its missile shields, because right next to those airports stood something else: Thule Air Base, the crown jewel of US missile defense in the north, early warning radars that track intercontinental ballistic missiles, satellites, and space-based threats. If China controlled the infrastructure around Thule, even indirectly, it could monitor, disrupt, or at minimum negotiate from a position of leverage. That was the first shock. The second came when Chinese mining firms attempted to secure stakes in rare earth mining projects in Greenland. Greenland isn't just rich in critical minerals, it is one of the few places on Earth where rare earths, uranium, and other strategic metals overlap geographically in commercially viable quantities. In a world where China already dominated the processing, adding Greenland's extraction would have pushed the US from dependency to strategic vulnerability. This was not a joke, not a meme, not a Trump curiosity. It was a crisis, the kind empires do not tweet about but plan for. Washington quietly intervened, Denmark stalled, financing collapsed, China's projects froze. The public narrative was about denial and sovereignty. The private narrative was about supply chains and missile defense. Why does the United States care so much? Why Greenland? Why airports? Why mine? Why urgency? Because underneath the public explanation lies the strategic one. If China controls Greenland, the US loses the Arctic. If the US loses the Arctic, it loses the century. This sounds dramatic until you trace the logic. Control of the Arctic means control of polar shipping, access to strategic minerals, early missile detection, hypersonic intercept lines, space surveillance integration, NATO's Northern Shield, alternative supply chains for future tech, oil and gas reserves, and the longest-range air approach to North America. That last point matters more than anything. Every major US war simulation involving China now begins in one of three places: Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, Arctic Circle, because the shortest path for missiles between superpowers is not over the Pacific, it is over the North Pole, and Greenland sits on that trajectory like a gatekeeper. During the Cold War, the US saw the Arctic as an insurance policy. Today, it sees it as the battlefield of the future. Great powers do not panic when things are stable. They panic when time begins to shrink. In Washington's internal assessments, China is not just rising, it is compressing time through industrial capacity, state-backed finance, and technological scaling. If China can secure minerals, processing, trade routes, rare earths, Arctic access, the US faces a future where its military is slower, its supply chains are dependent, its allies are uncertain, and its technological advantage evaporates. Greenland is one of the few places where those vectors intersect in one location. That is why there is urgency. That is why there is pressure. That is why denial and laughter exist. Empires mock what they fear until they find a way to justify intervention, which leads to the uncomfortable question: what happens if diplomacy fails? What happens if Greenland keeps drifting from Denmark? What happens if China returns with more capital, more leverage, and better timing? What does a superpower do when the map leaves it no alternative? To understand America's mindset about Greenland, you go back to the moment it tried to buy it. In 1946, Washington offered Denmark $100 million for Greenland, at a time when Europe was broke, exhausted, and afraid of the Soviets. The logic was simple: control the Arctic, deny rivals access, build radar and early warning systems, secure air routes, integrate northern defense. But Congress killed the plan, and the world moved on. 70 years later, the same logic returned, louder, faster, more desperate, because this time the rival was not the Soviet Union, it was China. And China was not trying to seize Greenland by force, it was doing something far more dangerous. It made Greenland an offer: loans, infrastructure, mining partnerships, port proposals, science cooperation, soft power wrapped around hard assets. This is where the investigative tone meets the empire strategist lens. China did not try to take Greenland. It tried to make Greenland need China. Empires do not fear rivals who attack, they fear rivals who integrate. Because integration lasts longer than victory. For decades, Greenland was not a country, it was a territory, dependent on Denmark, distant from America, unknown to China. But the ice melted, the minerals rose, and the world's attention shifted. Greenland discovered leverage, not military leverage, not diplomatic leverage, economic leverage. In 2009, it gained self-rule. In 2013, it passed laws favoring mining. In 2017, it flirted with independence. In 2018, China arrived. When a small territory with 57,000 people becomes the prize in a strategic war between two superpowers, something unprecedented happens. Its independence becomes valuable, its debt becomes strategic, its resources become bargaining chips, its ports become geopolitical assets. Which is why Washington panicked, not because China was coming, but because China was coming first. Every empire has a backbone. Britain's was coal and shipping, America's oil, industry and finance. China's is becoming minerals and manufacturing. To outsiders, Greenland's rare earth deposits look like geology. To superpowers, they look like leverage, because the future does not run on ideology. The future runs on materials: lithium for batteries, cobalt for energy storage, nickel for aerospace, graphite for anodes, rare earths for electronics, defense and energy, uranium for reactors and naval propulsion. Greenland has them, China processes them, the US needs them, and Denmark cannot use them. This creates a triangle no one wants to say out loud. If China secures Greenland and Arctic access, the US becomes strategically dependent. Dependency kills empires slower than defeat, but the result is the same. Washington ran those models years ago. They were not encouraging. In one scenario, the US could still build weapons, just slower. In another, it could not build certain weapons at all. In a third, its allies could not buy modern weapons without Chinese cooperation. When superpowers study maps, they are not looking at land, they are looking at timelines. The public narrative around Greenland focuses on minerals and melting ice. The classified narrative focuses on something colder: missile trajectories. During the Cold War, the shortest nuclear path from Moscow to Washington was over the North Pole. Every Pentagon planner knows this. Every Chinese strategist knows it now. Why does it matter today? Because the next military race isn't about aircraft carriers or tanks. It's about hypersonic missiles that fly low, fast, maneuverable, and nearly impossible to intercept. Their best approach vector into North America is not from the Pacific, it is from the Arctic. That's why Thule exists. That's why the US built early warning systems there. That's why Washington monitors every radar change north of Iceland. If China gained infrastructure access in Greenland, ports, airports, scientific stations, mining roads, it wouldn't need to station the PLA there. It would gain mapping data, ground terrain access, signal coverage, logistics planning, local influence, civilian dual-use assets. Superpowers win wars long before bullets are fired. They win them by shaping terrain. The most dangerous thing about China's push into the Arctic is that it was almost entirely non-military. No bases, no troops, no ships, no saber rattling, just financing, loans, infrastructure, investments, proposals, mining bids, joint ventures, research. That is how China approached Africa. That is how it approached Australia. That is how it approached South America. And that is how China approached Greenland. It walked through the door no one was guarding. Capital. When minerals meet debt, the laws of sovereignty weaken. When infrastructure meets dependency, foreign policy becomes negotiable. China doesn't need to conquer, it needs countries to choose, and small countries choose whoever makes them wealthy, not whoever makes them safe. Greenland saw China's money first. The US saw China's intentions later. Greenland is technically Danish territory, but Denmark is not a superpower. Denmark is not a global navy. Denmark is not a mineral processor. Denmark is not an Arctic militarize. It is a European state with alliances, limits, and budgets. Washington knows this. Beijing knows this. Greenland definitely knows this. For Denmark, Greenland is a responsibility. For China, Greenland is an opportunity. For America, Greenland is insurance. Denmark's nightmare isn't war, it's independence. Because if Greenland becomes independent, Denmark loses its Arctic gravity overnight. NATO loses coverage, Europe loses influence, and a resource-rich microstate becomes the most courted territory on Earth. Washington fears Chinese financing pushing Greenland toward independence. Beijing sees independence as a bargaining chip. Greenland sees it as dignity and leverage. Denmark sees it as collapsing. But empires do not care about dignity. They care about structure. Most analysts make a mistake. They assume the US wants Greenland. Incorrect. The US wants stability and denial. Deny rivals' access. Stabilize Arctic defense. Stabilize rare earth supply chains. Deny possibility of Chinese dual-use logistics. Greenland independence complicates all four. Washington cannot prevent independence, but it can influence the conditions of it. China cannot spark independence, but it can make it profitable. This is where the investigative voice and empire strategist intersect. Independence is not political, it is economical. The question is not, should Greenland be independent? The question is, who finances Greenland after independence? America cannot allow the answer to be China. For decades, the US treated Greenland as a Cold War relic. Then it woke up and treated it as a resource node, then as a strategic shield, then as a supply chain threat. By 2020, Washington changed tone. It did not ask Denmark for permission. It did not negotiate publicly. It simply opened a US diplomatic office in Greenland, the first in history. Embassies are not symbolic, they are signals. Then came the next move, US investment proposals in Greenland's mining sector, designed not to profit but to block Chinese bids. Then came the defense cooperation expansions. Then came intelligence agreements. Then came Arctic military coordination inside NATO. Small moves, quiet moves, but very loud to anyone studying the Arctic. America was not preparing to buy Greenland, it was preparing to deny China. Now we get to the core. What the media misses, what journalists underplay, and what strategists whisper. China doesn't want Greenland for Greenland. China wants Greenland because it completes a chain. The chain goes like this: minerals, processing, supply chains, manufacturing, exports, global tech dependency, and geopolitical leverage. If China controls that chain end to end, it gains something even nuclear weapons cannot guarantee: permanent influence. Nuclear weapons deter war, minerals plow, supply chains deter dominance. The US understands this. It lived against OPEC in the 1970s. It played against Japan in the 1980s. It lived it against China in the 2000s. Empires do not fear rivals who build weapons. They fear rivals who build systems. And China is building a system, a mineral industrial tech finance system. Greenland is the missing mineral node in a system designed to make the US dependent in a crisis. That is the hidden reason. That is why Greenland matters. That is why denial exists. That is why urgency exists. There are only 3 logical outcomes over the next 20-40 years. Scenario A: Denmark holds Greenland, stays under Denmark's umbrella. NATO keeps Arctic access. US keeps denial strategy. China is locked out unless it rewires the approach. Scenario B: independence with Western finance. Greenland becomes independent, but depends on US capital. Stable, slow independence. Minimal strategic disruption. Scenario C: independence with Chinese capital. The nightmare scenario for Washington. Because Chinese financing is not mining, it means ports, roads, airports, science stations, and political relationships. Dual use without bases. Influence without invasion. The US, it is not hyperbole. The Arctic decides. Hypersonic trajectories, early warning windows, ballistic interception arcs, semiconductor dependencies, battery supply chains, mineral flow control, energy corridors, and future shipping lanes. Greenland intersects all 8. When superpowers go to war, they don't fight for land, they fight for leverage. And leverage is exactly what Greenland provides. People think the US wants Greenland. People think China wants Greenland. People think Denmark wants to keep Greenland. But here's the twist. None of them get to decide. Greenland does. Greenland holds the minerals. Greenland holds the geography. Greenland holds the airports. Greenland holds the future leverage, which means Greenland is no longer a territory. It is a market, competed for by superpowers unwilling to admit they are competitors. The question is not who controls Greenland today. The question is who controls the financing tomorrow. Independence is not political. It is transactional. Empires do not buy land. They buy dependency. Ask strategists in Washington what truly scares them about China and Greenland, and they will not say missiles or bases. They will say something colder. If China wins the mineral century, America loses the technological century. If America loses the technological century, it loses the geopolitical century. That is the chain. Greenland is not the beginning of that chain. It is not the end. It is the missing piece. And missing pieces decide outcomes. This is why the US will never openly say it needs Greenland. It will never openly threaten. It will never openly negotiate publicly. It will just move, quietly, relentlessly, strategically. Because empires do not protect territory, they protect time, and the time to secure Greenland is running out.